How's everyone doing today? Right on. All right. I'm Sash. I think most of you know who I am. I've been here before and presented. And so I was asked, hey, can you come up to the Seattle Revit Users Group and give a presentation? I'm like, sure I can. So I had this presentation I've done before, and I actually always wanted to present it to you folks. And so here I am today. And we're going to talk about leveraging Revit to make presentations and models look attractive. And so that's why I'm here. All right, so if you don't know who I am, I have my master's degree from Montana State University. Any MSU grads here? It's got to be at least one, and that would be me apparently. Okay, so that's good. And I got my license out of the state of California, and I've been doing this for a while, and I've been with Ideate now for 4 years. And so, again, it's a pleasure to be here to work with you all today. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you some of the ways, and I underlined it and even italicized it. I didn't go as far as bolding it, but I wanted to show you some of the ways in which you can use Revit to make models look a little more attractive. And the whole idea here is, this is not the end-all, be-all. It's more of just an ideas generator, okay? Because the thing is, you can really get into Revit, as you know, and get in there and start playing around with the settings, either for better or for worse, and actually do some pretty neat things with the software. So I like to go in there and tinker around a little bit and kind of see what I can come up with. They may be terrible ideas. I'll leave that up to you. They may be great ideas, and they may be ideas that make you think of some fun things that you can do. So that's why I wanted to kind of show you some of the things that I've come up with. And by the way, there's a lot of great information out there on doing presentation stuff. You can go to AU and see it. So I didn't want to compete with that stuff because it's just kind of regurgitating the same information. So, so here are the few things that I've been kind of playing around with over time, and that's why I put this in a presentation. I just want to get an idea kind of who's in the audience today. So how many architects and designers? All right. And then how about mechanical and electrical engineers and plumbing, of course. Let's see, structural folks. You guys are all kind of in the same area, okay. What about contractors? 1, 2, 3, 4. Doctors, lawyers, and salespeople. We got one. Or account manager, sorry, account manager. All right, cool. So, all right, well, the good news is this should cover everybody with the exception of the account managers, all right? All right, so what we're going to do here, by the way, some of the stuff I'm going to show you at the beginning is kind of maybe fundamental. And the only reason why I do this is there are always folks that come to these presentations that are very new to Revit and trying to learn some things, so I want to be all-inclusive. So that's kind of one of the goals here. And then I'm going to talk about, because when I was in college, we built a lot of models by hand, right? So we always did them at a museum board and basswood. So I want to show you how maybe you can leverage Revit to kind of take that on and make your models look like museum and basswood. Totally up to you. And by the way, this could work for any material, doesn't matter. I just picked on those two because it takes me back to my college days. I'll also talk about some things that you can look at maybe with interior elevations. I got some mixed reviews on this. Some people are like, oh, I like the original way of doing it. And I was like, oh man, I was hoping to show people some more exciting things, but I'll let you be the judge of that. I'll also talk about like section perspectives and some of the things that go on with that. And then my favorite topic, other things. All right, so I'm gonna go over, again, this is just some fundamental stuff here, but nonetheless, I think this is really important to kind of go over and kind of hammer home why it's important to set some of these settings before you even think about tweaking your Revit models. All right, so, and sometimes I like to just show PowerPoint stuff, but I will be getting into the Revit model here in just a moment. So the first thing that I wanted to kind of go over here is the importance of setting your project orientation. And the reality is, and we've talked about this, right? I cannot stress and emphasize enough how important it is to have a BIM execution plan in place and coordinate all of your project base point, your survey point, your coordinate system stuff, even before you even start thinking about modeling anything in Revit. And with that, if you get all that coordinated, this stuff should come naturally, right? And of course, when you're looking at doing presentation drawings or renderings or any sort of energy analysis, you have to make sure you set your project north and Truenorth, right? And it's really more about Truenorth than project north, all right? But again, the whole idea behind project north and Truenorth is getting your project oriented and then of course, getting your drawings oriented as well. And of course, you can rotate Truenorth I think we've all done that, and we've probably all messed it up at one point in time. And then acquire coordinates, which is my favorite way of doing it, right? And who's here's done this method before? Oh, okay, cool. All right, so this is like really important stuff. And by the way, I'm not going to go into this. If you came to my last presentation here, I went through all of that. And that was fun, by the way. This was an awesome crowd. You guys loved it, so thank you for that. I love acquire coordinates and pushing coordinates around, trying to decipher what some of these error messages mean. Sometimes that can be a challenge. And new for Revit 2018, geolocation. Has anybody played around with that yet? So in my company, when we found out about this, everybody just started emailing me like, oh, this is all you, Sash, geolocation. Because again, I like the whole coordinate system. I just want to throw this out there. If you are acquiring coordinates from like a civil file or even an AutoCAD, just an AutoCAD DWG, I guess they're both DWGs, that have like a geo reference in there, if you acquire coordinates from it, it will also acquire the geolocation data. And I just went through an exercise with one of our big customers the other day to kind of understand how this whole thing works. And I have answers in case you have questions. All right, so that stuff's really, really important, right? So again, in addition to getting your project oriented, it's also important to actually get it located, right? Because orienting it to Truenorth and Project North doesn't tell the end user where the project's located. So again, if you're trying to get accurate renderings, accurate sun and shadow settings, you have to tell Revit, where am I located? The geolocation thing, by the way, that's new to Revit 2018 is actually really handy because it can get all that data for you, which is cool. Okay, and then the next thing that I like to do is start thinking about setting up some still views, right? And who's done this before where you go in and you set up a sun settings? I've done it, so I'm gonna raise my hand. Okay, so if you plan on doing any sort of sun and shadow studies, any sort of renderings, it's really important to come into this dialog box over here and start setting up your settings, right? You can pick an infinite amount of days, even though there's only 365 days per year, so I guess there really isn't an infinite amount. But up to 365 days a year, you can come in and set up a whole bunch of stills. So I picked Portland, Oregon, because that's where I live. You could do Seattle, where you guys are all from. But again, you can come in here and set up what time of the day, what day of the year it is, and specify what the ground plane is, so that way you get some accurate shadow settings, okay? Again, really important, but also from a presentation standpoint, this stuff really helps out, okay? Again, some of this is kind of new for some, but not the other folks. Okay, the next thing here are material definitions. Who loves materials? Really? They're awesome. Brian loves materials. You're dealing with materials right now in your house, so that's good. Okay, I'm a huge fan of materials. I personally think they've done a great job with materials, okay? But if you've dinked around with them before, they can be a little bit of a daunting task just because some of the settings can seem a little confusing. And so if you are new to materials, who is new to materials or new-ish? All right, a couple of folks. All right, so either we have people that are like them and maybe have played around or are new to them. Okay, I'll just give you a brief kind of introduction to how the materials work in Revit in case there was any sort of confusion here. So the materials in Revit make up both the graphical representation, so basically when you're looking at things when you cut with a cutting plane, or when you're looking at things from a projection standpoint, right? So like if we take acoustical ceiling tile as an example, there's basically a projection for that, right? So when you look at like construction documentation, it's that stippled pattern that you typically see on most of your documents. So materials, that's where all that stuff is set, right? So you make a material pattern and then you apply that pattern to that material. But also the other important thing about materials is the rendering settings, right? So when you go into the whole rendering side of things, the graphical, whatever that tab's called now, I can't think of it, but when you go into that tab, you're basically setting up how the materials are gonna be represented when you hit the render button. And I always tell people, there's a big difference between the two tabs. One is basically rendering and presentation drawings, the other is more of documentation, all right? As far as I understand, they don't really intermingle too much except for like a texture alignment. You can do a texture alignment and say, oh, I have this brick pattern here, and here's what my documentation line work looks like. I want to take the textures and align them so that when you go from hidden line mode to realistic, the patterns align. Okay, you can do that much in terms of like their overlap. Okay, but basically materials are made up of assets, and this is why it's really powerful. And if you ever look at like the out-of-the-box Revit materials, I don't think they really did a great job of like setting them up. And the only reason why is some of the materials and some of the assets can be used for other things, right? So we come in here, we say, oh, we have a ceiling grid that's a 24 by 24. But that's not really a ceiling grid, that's just a 24 by 24 pattern. So why call it a ceiling grid when that can be used for tile, right? So those are the kinds of things that if I like to go back and unmanage and remanage, if you know what I'm saying. So again, I think it's really critical that if you are going to get into materials and set these up for your office, this is really where the rubber meets the road. Not only from like a presentation standpoint, but also from a management standpoint of your documentation. Because I don't like repeat information. All right, so all your materials basically have all of these tabs in here. So you have identity, graphics, appearance, physical, and thermal. Those are what make up a material. And the physical and thermal are actually optional. You don't need to apply those to materials. So if you're not interested in doing any sort of structural calculations, like if you're gonna take it out to robot, or if you're not interested in doing any sort of thermal calculations, you just basically wanna make it look good in your documents, both from a rendering perspective and documentation, you can actually omit these two tabs, okay? Again, graphics is what represents the documentation part where appearance represents the rendering, okay? So that's the whole thing. The one thing I want to point out, and if there's anything you take away from this slide right now, is that don't think of materials in Revit as like an element, okay, or a whole assembly. So I'll just use this as an example right here. This Logitech clicker right here is not a material. And I think a lot of people confuse that. Like, and again, I'm not going to, I hopefully won't go through Revit and find Logitech clicker in there. I think that's getting excessive. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I love when people model the casters and everything on their chairs, but it's like we're going too far sometimes, right? But the whole idea behind this Logitech clicker is it's made up of many materials, okay? And that's what I'm looking for in my materials dialog box. I'm not looking for a Logitech clicker. Instead, I'm looking for like a matte plastic right here and a shiny plastic and maybe a LCD display. Those would be the different materials. The actual object itself is the clicker. That's what you're modeling, but then the different subcomponents of it are what the materials are. Does that make sense? And that's the key thing that I wanted to point out about materials is that this black plastic that you see right here can be used for multiple things. Logitech doesn't own the rights to these exact, component. Well, they may own the rights to the components, but not the materiality. This is kind of a rubberized coating, okay? So again, you may find this used in other parts of your project. So again, managing that you should be careful with because it can really confuse the end user, okay? So I wanted to kind of point that out. So speaking of, and then I'm going to go into Revit and just kind of reiterate some of these dialog boxes. I wanted to talk to you about assets because when you look in the Revit dialog box, especially the ones that come with Autodesk, or come with Revit that is, there's a lot of assets in there. And again, I look at assets as things that I want to pull off the shelf that have pre-baked looks and data to it that when I mash them together become either the material itself or put together with the many materials becomes the element. And when you look in Revit, if you've bummed around through the materials dialog box, you'll see in that dialog box that there are materials that have like specific assets. So I'll use masonry as an example. And if you look up over here, this is just masonry brick. You see that? And when I look over here under this appearance asset, I can see it says masonry, right? And when I look at the masonry asset, there are specific properties that pertain to this masonry behavior, like a relief pattern, okay? To me, that's more like a bump map, right? But they call it a relief pattern in this sense. So when you render it, you get that relief in that brick. Because you've probably taken a photocopy of like a brick wall and stuck it on your wall. Yeah, you can tell it's brick, but it has no texture to it because it's literally a photocopy, right? But if you give it some bumpiness, then you can get some real textures out of it, right? So while it's great, and this, by the way, this is my opinion, while it's great that you can go pick a masonry asset and even still use an image here and apply a relief pattern, if you like tinted brick, you can certainly apply tint to your brick. While that's all great, I don't find them to be flexible in the sense of customizing their settings. You're very limited on what you can customize when you use a specific asset. And again, we're just using an image here, but I don't get a whole lot of properties out of it. I'm going to show you in a moment. But maybe we can consider using a generic asset. Now, if you look at this, and this may be a little hard to see up here, but what's cool about generic assets is the fact that you can come in here and really tweak a lot more settings. If you like reflective brick, you can have reflective brick. It's your choice. You're using a generic asset, all right? Again, you can apply that, the bump to it, the relief pattern as they called it under the brick, but here you can apply the same images, but now you have a lot of other options like self-illuminating brick. That's kind of cool. I like that. I can still apply the tint to it. So that gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of rendering. So maybe when you get back to your office after this, maybe you should go take some of your materials and tweak them a little bit and play around with the generic asset, right? And I'll show you how you can access all of that stuff. But I like this because I have a lot more flexibility in tweaking the settings. Because again, I'm using an image for here. It doesn't matter, you don't have to use an image, you can start from scratch, right? It may not be as realistic looking, but you certainly can do that. And of course, you can always save your materials to your favorites, or you can export out to your company library if your IT folks don't have everything locked down so tight, right? You can certainly do that, and you can use the transfer project standards feature if you want to transfer materials from one project to another. Of course, if they're in your favorites, you can bring it in that way. And remember, if you download images from the internet, never put them on your desktop. Right? Because what happens is Revit doesn't bake those images in your Revit model. So when you hand that file off to somebody else and they go to render it to the cloud or render it on their machine, it won't find those materials. So again, managing those, you have to be very careful with that too. Put it in your project folder and reference it because it will create a path to that. Make sense? All right, let me just quickly switch over to Revit here because I just want to show you what I'm talking about here, just for those that want to see this live here. All right, so far we're still recording, so that's good news. All right, what I'm going to do here is just briefly show you where some of these settings are located in case you're unaware of it. But under the Manage tab, there's a lot of wonderful things here. And the first one here is Location. And by the way, I'm using Revit 2017 for this, so you won't see the geolocation reference in here. How many folks are using 2018, like actively? Not one. How do you like it? So far, so good? All right. And I take it most people are using 2017 at this point? All right. So right here, if I can click on this dialog box, if you've never been in this dialog box, you definitely want to locate your project. And if you have coordinate data, like exact, what do we call that coordinate data? I know, right? I'm putting everybody on the spot. Okay, anyhow, if you have coordinate data, GPS data, that's what it is. You can put some of that stuff in here, but if you have the project address, that works just fine. And again, it uses weather station data, so you can grab stuff nearby your project or far away if you want. And again, if you use 2018 and acquire coordinates from a CAD file that has a georeferencing, it'll grab all that data from that file, which is really cool. Okay, and again, when you get the location, it gives you the dry bulb and wet bulb stuff. And then, of course, my favorite topic in all of Revit, the whole coordinate and shared coordinate stuff you can deal with over here as well, okay? All right, so that's the one important thing. Got to give my computer a moment to think here. Okay, so in addition to dealing with the location, the other thing too is if you want to deal with the coordinate stuff, you can certainly acquire coordinates and publish coordinates if you want to. And also, if you don't acquire coordinates, but you have the difference between Project North and True North, you can certainly rotate your True North if you want to. Okay, I'm not going to do that for this example here. So those are some of the things that you want to do up front. And then what I wanted to talk about regarding materials, if I come over to the materials dialog box over here, I'm just going to go ahead and make this a little bit smaller. What I wanted to get at over here is if I look at something like brick as an example. All right, here's one that's called Masonry Brick, right? So again, here are the 3 tabs that are a must. And you know, because when you right-click, you can't delete these tabs. And if I click over here, you can add a physical and a thermal if it's important to you. You don't have to, but you certainly could. The graphics tab, as I mentioned before, really represents how you look at the model from like a documentation purpose, right? Or a standpoint. And also if you set your model to like, shaded, that's what you're looking at is the settings under the graphics tab. If you go to the appearance tab, this is the rendering material applied, right? All right, so if I look over here, the masonry brick, this is what I was talking about with the asset. This one's called masonry, okay? And again, there's not that many settings over here. You see that? There really are not that many. All right, and again, if I look at this soldier course over here, this is using masonry. But what you can always do is you can certainly replace this asset right up in here. And if I click on it, you'll get quite the dialog box over here regarding assets. But if I come over here and do like generic, my favorite one, you can come over here and find a lot of different generics. Like for example, I can just use like default. And you see right here, it's a generic asset. Okay, and I can come in over here and I can replace this asset, okay, and then of course I gotta close this dialog over here, and now I'm not gonna go through the whole setup, you guys know how to do this, right? But when I look over here, I can pick an image file and I can use that same brick if I want to. But look, you get reflectivity, you get transparency, call outs, you see you get a lot more settings. So you can take that brick one that you saw earlier and match its settings and go even further with this. Does that make sense? That's what I wanted to point out, that I like that. And if you're not aware of this, up here, where there's a hand that says 0, be very careful. If you ever go and duplicate materials, you are not duplicating the asset. Remember, that brick could be used for other materials. If you need to tweak the settings and have like brick 1 and brick 2, and they have slightly different look to it, you need to duplicate the brick asset, okay? Or this default asset in this case. And the reason why is that hand means it's being shared with however many materials it says up there. Okay, and you've probably discovered this. You go change the color and all of a sudden you look at it out of your left eye and you see the other material above it also change color. You're like, that's kind of weird. And you do it again and again, expecting different results. But we call that what? Insanity. Okay, it won't change unless you duplicate the asset, okay, if you need it to be different, okay? Again, if this black plastic, exactly as it is going to be used for other materials, hey, look at this, my Logitech mouse, as a matter of fact, then you don't need to duplicate it. But if you need to change it from glossy to flat, then you will need to duplicate that asset and make the minor change, okay? Again, some of this may seem very fundamental. I just wanted to point out some of the importance of that, okay? All right, I'm going to move on and talk about prettier things. Any questions so far? All right, cool. All right, now let's get into some more exciting stuff, because that's all front-end stuff. Nobody likes that. Okay. All right, who likes museum board? All right, I got a few. Must be just out of architecture school, maybe? We built a lot of models out of that stuff. I like museum board, except when I got my greasy fingers on it, then it looked really bad, but okay. I wanted to talk to you about how can you make your model, especially if you wanted to present it maybe to a client, not shown. Sometimes people freak out. They look at their model like, is that what my place is going to look like? You're like, no, we're doing some studies here. And maybe you want to show more of kind of like a massing form, although you could do massing for this. But maybe you want to make it look like a museum board. Why not? Okay, well, here's one thing that you can do. You can look at dealing with overriding some of the phase settings. Now, I just use the word override. I'm not a big override person, by the way. That's kind of like the people freak out with the whole bilayer versus not bilayer, right? Okay, well, this is going to be one of those situations. The first thing I always recommend is if you're going to be tweaking any of the settings, take your current design documentation model and do a save as and make it a presentation model, all right? Because you may upset some folks, if you know what I mean, when they come back to the model like everything looks like museum board. Okay. All right. So one of the things that you can do with this particular method is you can actually leave your project phasing as is. That's pretty cool. All right. And then what I like to do is I come into my phase filters and I add like a filter. Okay. Now I'm calling this museum or basswood. I think that's a bad idea, even though I'm showing it to you, because you can really make it any sort of material you want, because you don't apply museum board or basswood right in here. So you can call this something else. It could be a presentation material. It really doesn't matter. But take a look. I did an override for both the new and existing. Okay, and the reason why I did it for new and existing is in case you have a phased project, right? All right, and then under my demolished and temporary, I just left it to not display because I don't want to show demolished or temporary elements. All right, so far so good, right? This is pretty simple. Okay, and then what I do is I come over to the graphic overrides and I take the new and existing and I apply my material right here. And what that basically does, it blankets that material over all the new and existing elements. Because I will tell you, if you try to go into every material and change the material asset, the appearance asset to this museum board, you're not going to like yourself. It's a lot of work. And Revit's going to chug away trying to apply those material changes, right? So we want to avoid all that by making this pretty simple. Again, don't do this to your design model just to be on the, you want to be on the safe side, okay? So we're applying that over here. And then what you got to do is then in your view, so you're going to make a bunch of 3D views, hopefully perspectives because they look better, right? You'll come into your perspective views and you'll apply that phase filter that you just created to that view. And actually, you're not doing any damage at all to your Revit model. So that's what's nice about this. You're not using phasing as a way of overriding things. You're just basically coming in here and applying a different filter to the view. Okay? And then, hey, remember these settings that we did up front? We came in, we set some sun and shadows stuff up for the still setting, so we're making it look good. We set it to realistic. All right, and then if you want to make the museum board, again, you can start with any asset you want, generic or not. I started with like a ceramic asset because it had a good look to it. And you come in here, and I even added a little texture to it because, you know, the museum board has a little bit of a grainy texture to it if you want it to look like that. So I added some finished bumps. And again, I just found a bumpy PNG file for that, right? And it may be hard to see on here, but here's an easy way to make your model look like museum board. Okay, and by the way, I'm just using the out-of-the-box, Revit data set. What do you think? Maybe an idea? And by the way, this can apply to any material. It doesn't matter. Okay? Although, don't do it to air. That means you're showing the client nothing at that point. Okay? If you're into basswood, I like basswood. Same exact principle. I make a basswood material. I come in, I found a wood asset. Even though I didn't use generic, if you want to make it quick and dirty, you can certainly do this. I even changed the sample size to try to mimic, like if I bought sheets of basswood and was cutting it up to make a model. So I was like, I'm going to take the sample size, which I think was like 12 by 12, and I bumped it up to like 60 by 60, or whatever you like, okay? Ooh, I'm going to show you an image here. If you like to render glazing, so I'm thinking back in the day when we built models, we'd do basswood for everything, and then we'd go get the plastic to do glazing. That requires you, if you want to make it easy, to put the glazing on a future phase, okay? So you make another phase called glazing, and then you set your view to the glazing phase so that everything prior to that, which is existing, is basswood, and then everything on the glazing phase is glazed, right? So you'd have to move your windows or your curtain walls to the glazing phase in order to render it that way. Does that make sense? I'll show you that in a moment. All right, so here's basswood, and you can see I have the repeat. By the way, you can go on Google, and if you don't like repeat, you can do some research on how to make your own textures so they don't repeat, right? All right, so there's a basswood model, and then there's one with glazing, okay? And by the way, you have to render it to get this result. It's not gonna look good with shading set because you're not gonna get the reflections and refractions. You're just not gonna get all of that. What do you think? Is that? So these are just ideas. Remember, I'm not here to say this is how you have to do it. All right? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So the question was, can you elaborate on moving the glazing to the future phase? I should be careful with my terminology by saying future phase. What you want to do is come in and add a phase at the very end of all your phases and just call it like glazing. And then what you have to do is you want to select anything that has a window. Now, it can get a little tricky because, like, what do you do with a door that has glazing in it, right? Because that's a family. Because the door will become that whole component that you have to move to the glazing phase. So there could be a little bit of trickiness over there. But essentially what you're doing is when you set up the phasing, grab your model and all the elements. You can use Ideate Explorer if you have it and select all your glass and then just move the phasing, just change the phases from whatever it is to the glazing phase, okay? And then what you can do is when you go to your view to render, you set your phase to that newest phase and then set your phase filter to the rendering look, and then hit the render. So basically you're moving your elements to a different phase. So again, you want to be careful with that because you will screw up the documentation model, you'll screw up the scheduling. You can see where it can get kind of ugly, right? And this is also a good opportunity if you want to make your models render faster and streamlined, you can clean out all that extra stuff. You don't need your title blocks, you don't need your schedules anymore, you just need the model. But does that help clarify that? That's a good question. So does it work with actual filters instead of phasing? I haven't tried it with filters. I tried making it, I did actually, and I remember it was kind of a pain to do with filters, but you could certainly try it. I just liked it was so easy to do it with the phasing dialog box. It was literally one click of a switch where I didn't have to go manage all the categories, when I build a filter. And I'll be honest with you, filters, I love them, but it's like, gosh, we're missing a lot of categories in there, which is also kind of a bummer, right? You've probably noticed that, I still want annotation categories in filters because there's some things I want to filter out. I'm working on a blog post right now, and I need filters to really come through for me, but they won't because it's an annotation element. And so I find that sometimes the filters can be limited. Although in a model as simple like this, I think everything would be covered by filters, so it's certainly worth looking at. But the phasing was just so much faster and so much easier. That's the route that I went. No, that's what's beautiful about filters, right? They just won't because it's like a filter, just applying it, override settings on top of that. So it's worth looking into for sure. All right, cool? All right, let me just go here real quick. I'll just show you what I was talking about with some of those settings. Let's see, here's the basswood with glass. So let me just go to this aerial perspective over here. There we go. There we go. So here's, here's that aerial perspective. Let me just zoom extents here. You got this computer. There we go. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about here real quick, just so you're aware of it, is when I go to the Manage, I can go to the Filters tab right up here. And I can click on the filters, and here was that rendering doors and windows. So this is what I was talking about with the future phase. Okay, so that's what I was talking about here. And then under my phase filters, all I did is I came in over here and I added a museum and basswood. Now take note, there's a slight difference between what I'm showing you here and what's on that slide that I showed you. I set new to by category because that's going to represent all the windows. Those are all going to be considered new elements. Otherwise, they'll put an override, and that override will be based on what you see under the graphic overrides tab. So I wanted those to be untouched. Does that make sense? For the you phasing buffs out there, I wanted to make sure the windows were set to new so they would render as they are set in the material dialog box. But then when I come over here, existing, it's overridden, and it's overridden per this setting over here. In this case, nothing's going to happen with the new category, even though it's set to basswood, because right here under museum board, new is not overridden. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about over here. Okay, and then all I did in this case is I came in over here and I just set my phase to the newest phase right there, and then I set museum or basswood. Okay, and then all it did is it applied the rendering material to all the existing elements while all of the curtain walls and doors were put on the newest phase with no override. And that's how I was able to render this with glazing. Does that make sense? Again, these are just ideas. You may have a better way of doing this, okay? But I just wanted to throw it out there that you can pretty quickly make your models look different and present it in a very different way without really doing too much damage. Or if you don't want to do the windows, you just want to keep it all in the same phase, then you can even do it a lot quicker by just applying a material override to the new and existing. Cool? All right. Come back over here, not over here. Just do this. That's a lot easier. Okay. I was playing around with interior elevations, and I was just looking at a couple settings over here. And to me, I wanted to add maybe just a little more interest to them. Some people like it, some people don't, but I'll leave it up to you. How many of you played with that squiggly line thing, that feature, right? The jitter, I think that's what they call that setting. It's an interesting one, but again, I haven't really used it a whole lot, but I was playing around with it on here. So one of the things that I did over here was I took an interior elevation. This is a true interior elevation. So I dumped, an elevation marker in there and played around with the crop a little bit. And then I changed the view to a hidden line style, okay? And I set it to anti-aliasing so it's not so pixelated. I also turned on some shadows so you can kind of see the shadows over here. And then if you want to play around with depth queuing, you can certainly do that, right? How many of you have played around with the depth queuing feature? All right, it's about what I expected. Not too many people are playing around with it, but it gives you that kind of depth perception. Instead of everything looking like it's all right here, you can actually get a little bit of depth out of it. I'd like to see more line weight changes, with stuff beyond, but depth queuing unfortunately doesn't do that. I used fake lighting, as I call it, right? So yeah, sunlight can come in through the north window if you want to, right? So I just played around with the azimuth and altitude, right? Just to bring some light in here. Doesn't matter which way it was viewed, I just wanted to get some interesting. Also, the other thing I wanted to point out is I did a material override in the visibility graphics. And a better way you can do that if you don't want to go override the projection settings for your categories is you can use a filter, because that goes really fast. Because again, you're not overwriting that view, you're just putting a filter in there, and you can disable that filter in a matter of seconds if you want to, okay? But again, we got this kind of look to it. And I was like, okay, that's fine. It's pretty simple. I'm not really conveying materiality here. I'm just making it kind of look like a hand sketch, right? And then what I did is let me play around with a 3D view and just see maybe what I can get with interior elevations. So how many of you use that Orient To View feature in Revit? All right. How many of you have never heard of it before? Okay, so Orient To View is kind of cool, right? So basically what it does is if you put a building section or something in your Revit model, let's say it's a section that's this wide and it's this deep, if you go to a 3D view and you find that little arrow around that view cube, which everybody ignores that, but I love that view cube. But if you left click on that arrow, there's an option that says Orient To View. And then you can pick section and then pick the section that you cut. And what it does, it takes that 3D view and it puts a section box that matches the actual building section, which is kind of cool because then you get a 3D section out of it with that same depth based on that section view that you cut. All right, so that's what I did here. I basically set a depth and a width, just like it was a building section, but you can actually do it also with the elevations, which is what I did. I used that for the Orient To View. So this is actually a 3D view, but one of the advantages of doing it with a 3D view is I was able to get the sunlight to come through. You see that? Because they're not going to come through on a 2D view, but with a 3D view, I was able to get the sunlight to come through here. And you can even go to the 3D view and pull the box back if you want to capture some more window. You can certainly do that. But I was like, I kind of think it's a little more interesting. Some people don't, some people do. I'm going to go with I think it's more interesting. So again, same kind of basic principles here. I applied the overrides to it, but I was able to get a little more effect from the lighting. Again, I'm using just an azimuth and altitude over here. The only bummer is you can't get the depth queuing to work because it won't work in a 3D view. All right, so if you're absolutely love the depth queuing, there's going to be a sacrifice in this view where that option is grayed out. Does that make sense? So that's kind of how that one works over there. So let me just show you real quick what I was talking about over here. I'll come back to Revit here. Let's see here. Actually, I'll just do this one here. So here's one that has the sketchy lines. Okay, this is a interior elevation. You can see it right here. And if I go to the visibility graphics, you can do it two ways. I just did it really quick and dirty over here. I just did an override for my projection, but you can certainly, and it's probably even better, I would just do it as a filter. Okay, you can totally do it as a filter, and in one click or two clicks, you can apply that without having to actually override the setting right here, okay? It's totally up to you. I like filters for that purpose. So all I did is I came in here and I did some overrides for my patterns, okay? So as you can see over here, I did it for right here. Also lines, so if you want to bump up the thickness of your casework, like the profile, you can certainly do that as well. All right, so that's how I was able to get kind of this gray tone. And that way I made all the materials kind of look the same instead of trying to define them, all right? And then, if you haven't done this before, if you left click on the visual display style right here, and take note, it's not set to shaded. it's just set to hidden line mode, okay? If I come over here to graphic display options, if you haven't really been here before, I definitely recommend you come in and start playing around with like the smooth lines with anti-aliasing. And then do I want to cast shadows and ambient shadows, right? And add some sketchiness to the look. And again, here's where depth cueing, I don't even have it turned on over here, but if you want to play around with the depth cueing, you can certainly show depth and play around with these settings. And then for lighting, you see how the lighting says sunlight from the top right? Again, that was all set based on my sun and shadow settings, which you can grab right here if you want to. Okay, and you can see right here, I made one called sunlight from the top right, and I just set an azimuth and altitude under lighting. Apparently I got really precise with 17 degrees instead of 15 degrees. All right, maybe I like the altitude just a little bit more. Okay, so that's how that one was set up. But if I go to the 3D view, it's very similar in a lot of ways. Okay, here, same thing, the sun settings are almost identical. See that right there? Okay, everything's all pretty much the same. The only downside is when you come over here to depth cueing, you can't click it. Okay, so it doesn't work for these 3D views. But what was this that I did? I'm going to unlock this view right here. Let me just show you what it really is. There we go. Whoops. Here, let me just not crop the view. There we go. See that? That's actually my interior elevation. I was just taking a peek inside of here like that. Okay? Does that make sense? So that's how I approach that. Let me just go ahead and use this awesome tool here. Okay? So that's how that one works. Okay? Any questions about that? So again, these are just ideas. Maybe you can take this even further and develop it. So again, I'll just go through this real quickly here. You can play around with this, better yet, do a filter. Be sure to adjust the settings under the view control. So by left-clicking right over here and playing around with the graphic display options. And then use view templates. You don't want to do this 500 times. Use a view template to play around, or not play around, but basically set everything, make it consistent using view templates. Okay, how many of you have done, yeah? Yeah, so he has a question about documenting the 3D view. So if I come back over here, when you save orientation and lock view, let's take a look under the Annotate tab. You could still do tags here. Do you see that? And text, but you have to save the orientation and lock the view. That's a new-ish feature in Revit. Before, I don't know how many of you have done this, you go do an isometric detail, and you're like, I just want to orbit it just a little bit more, and all of a sudden the tags fly, or not the tags, but the text fly off. Well, save orientation and lock view, that's right here, this house with a padlock. That one will prevent you from making that mistake, which I've made millions of times. So you can still do some basic documentation in this view if you want to. Great question. Cool. All right, I'm going to come back over here. Okay, how many of you have done section perspectives before? All right, cool. These are, I kind of find them a little bit trickier to find sometimes. You have to kind of do a little bumming around in order to get the section perspective to work. So I put together a slide here where I try to best illustrate what some of these settings mean. And so if you actually go to create like a perspective view, you want to actually look at the properties of that section view. So you just go to the section view and look at the properties and turn on the section box. If you don't do that, then you don't get the option to show the section box and actually manipulate it, okay? So basically a section perspective is not just a feature in Revit where you go to the view tab and hit, section perspective. You got to do the section, turn on the crop box, and then you can actually create the section perspective. So I wanted to point out just a couple of the settings here. So if you ever looked at the camera, which I'm still waiting for a feature where I can go to a floor plan and it will show me all my cameras. I kind of want that because then I can see what's actually out there. But one of the things is, if you ever look at like just a section view, what typically happens is your eye and target levels are the same. But as soon as you start playing with like the target level and lifting it up, I describe this cone of vision as a square rectangular cone. And that's kind of what you're seeing right up over here is, here's where I'm standing and here's where I'm looking, and this is the top of the cone and this is the bottom of the cone. So I'm basically for this demonstration over here, I'm raised up a little bit. That's basically what I'm doing. I'm looking up and kind of at the end of the cone. Getting some reflection, some sound reflection here, it sounds like. Okay, so that's what this represents over here. And here's kind of your eye and target elevation. So we're basically implying that we have a height over here off the ground plane for your eye and target, okay? And you can adjust your camera angle over here. And here's the section box. And so all I did is, if you go in your project browser and find this a perspective view, you can right click on it and say show camera. And then if you enable the section box, there's your section box. And the key thing to getting the section perspective right is to take your section box and pull it inward from where you're standing. And that's how you get the section perspective to start behaving. What I like to do, and unfortunately you can't snap to some of these things, I'll draw like a reference plane over here. I'll draw a reference plane over here to kind of know where I'm standing so I can at least gauge how far off I want the section. And again, if you want to make it look interesting, let's look at proportions here. Don't do like a 4:3. That's just kind of old school, right? I'm a big fan of 16:9 or 16:10. And then adjust the section box distance to create the desired look. I was playing around a lot with this, and I kind of liked like the 8-foot distance from where I was standing to where the section started. It seemed kind of interesting to me. All right. So here's an example of some renderings. And again, these will look this way when you render it. So here's one that was rendered. And by the way, I love the cloud rendering because I tried to render this on my computer and it almost caught on fire. And it got like one corner rendered. I'm like, oh, this is going to take forever. And then I sent this up to the cloud and it was back in 10 minutes, which is kind of cool. All right. And it only cost me, I don't know, 5 cloud credits, 4 cloud credits. And I do have a lot of cloud credits. That's one of the advantages of being on this side, right? We get a lot of cloud credits. But if you're willing to pony up a few Bitcoin or whatever they're using nowadays to buy cloud credits, you can certainly get this back a lot quicker than you can. And you don't have to risk burning your machine up, which is what I almost did. All right. So again, I like this. And if you're wondering how I got the red in here, and I'm a red guy. I like red cars and red everything. So I was like, I'm going to pick red for my section. So there's a quick setting for that, and let me just show you this real quickly, and then we'll move on to the last part. All right, let me see it. Maybe another Revit model here. Here we go. The one that's called Section Perspectives. All right, and again, take a look. See how I subcategorized everything? I'm all about the project browser management, right? And I didn't use a special parameter for this. I just made a new view name for it, right? Did you know you can do that? You can select the 3D view and change it. You go to edit type and create a new name and it'll categorize it. So that's pretty cool. Apparently I have to do zoom extents, or that was not intended. There we go. Okay, so here's a section perspective, and again, this is not rendered. Okay, but once it's rendered out, then it will give you the appropriate look. And I don't know if you've ever paid attention to this, but a lot of times when you go in, let me see if I can select. Oh, I just deselected, so let me do this again. Just trying to grab the ceiling here real quickly. A lot of times when you go to like edit type, you can adjust the coarse fill. Have you noticed that? You can certainly do that. Notice here, this one's set to black, all right? And my view here is set to fine, and I'll explain why I set that to fine in just a moment. But the reality is, in order to get that red, you don't want to have to do that, okay? There's a quicker way to actually get the cut to be consistent. Because again, I'd have to figure out all the categories of elements that are being cut, and I have to go in and look at their properties and change that. And some of them probably don't even have this as a setting. Okay. Now, one of the things that I've done here, let me just show you real quickly. If I go to Visibility Graphics, and again, I'm trying to minimize what I'm rendering. Okay, I don't want to have a whole bunch of other elements in here. So I come in here, and I turn off the categories of things that I'm not interested in rendering, okay? And then take note over here, like for example, under ceilings, I set the detail level to coarse. And again, you can make a view template out of this to make it a lot more consistent. You can also look at doing filters as well if you want to. So I picked kind of the main categories and I set them to coarse. Then what I did over here is under edit type for the view, because you see right here it says section perspective, under edit type, there's my coarse material right there. And I made a material called poche red. That's all I did. That's how I got the red in there. I was like, I'm just going to make a new asset called red, and I'm just going to use that. And that way it'll render appropriately, because notice my view is set to the ready for rendering right here. See that right there? That works out well. Now, why did I set it to a fine mode over here? Well, the reason why is if I miss any categories where I overrode the detail level, I want to make sure I capture those in a fine level of detail. And it may be hard to see on your screen, but a good example right here is this column. If you've played around with structural columns, when you go to a coarse mode, they're very disappointing. It looks like your building is being held up by a really thin stick, right? And so I wanted to, not good. It works in architecture school, because you're just gluing it in a model, right? It doesn't really work out here. So I wanted to make sure if I missed anything, I'm getting it at least in a fine mode, okay? You have to be careful though, some categories, as you know, like doors, some people like to put the latch set in there and it turns on when you're in fine mode, right? So just be very careful of that kind of stuff. And again, I just sent this right up to the cloud. The cloud contacted me and said, I'll be done in 10 minutes. And in my inbox was my rendering, and I stuck it in my presentation. And I can guarantee you 0% post-processing, and that's what you see over here. So this is a really quick exercise. So again, these are just some ideas. So section perspectives are quite a bit of fun, and as I mentioned before, the way you find them, if I come over here, I just made a camera view. I just came in over here, and if you right mouse click on it, here's your show camera and show section box. Okay, so if I go to show section box, there's my section box. I took it way wide. Okay, but the only way this is going to work, just to let you know, is you have to make sure that you turn on your section box. Where is that? I guess it makes it easier if you come in over. Let me just come back over here real quick. What's that? There it is. Gosh, I'm having trouble here. Okay, there it is, section box. If you don't turn that on, when you right-click on this, you will not get the show section box option. Okay, and that's how you can get it. And then, again, if you look at where this is, oops, let me come back. Right, if you look at where this is and compare it to where the camera is set back a little bit from the section box. So play around with that when you get a chance. So that's the task for today. Okay, the last thing I wanted to go over, looks like we're going to finish right on time, which is cool. I was just playing around with like dealing with linked files and maybe putting a glass box around a structural link, or you can do this with your MEP model, it doesn't matter. And it's a little hard to see up on here, so I do apologize. I wanted to take the structural model and believe it or not, there's that red again, right? And you can make it whatever material you like or color you like. If you like green, you can certainly do green. But what I basically did is I took the architectural model and I turned the whole thing into glass. And then I took the structural model and turned it into red. Now, I did get a question that came up in my last presentation about using filters, and I tried using filters and it just turned into a huge task that I also had some rendering issues with it, and so I had to back out of it. And the reason why the question came up is I had to go into the structural model and manipulate some of the settings in there so when it was linked in, it would render appropriately. So again, these are just for presentation purposes. I'm not really worried about modifying somebody's instruments of service, if you know what I'm saying. This is just for presentation purposes. So real quickly, for the architectural settings, all I did is I just went in the architectural settings and I just made a transparency, all right? And one of the things I wanted to point out, if you've ever used a glazing asset, you want to be very careful with rendering and how many sheets of glass you use, because if you put a lot of sheets of glass in there, it's going to take even longer to do the rendering. I ended up backing this down to actually just one anyways, even though the image over here shows two. But I certainly did that. And if you want to add a little tint to that glazing, you can certainly do that. So in the architectural file, I just created a transparency material using a glazing asset. Okay. And then in the structural file, yep, I went in the structural file, I created a structural red. It could be structural green. Just don't make it air, okay? And again, I made a generic one here that was color. I gave it some glossiness. But other than that, I didn't really do a whole lot, although self-illuminating can be kind of fun. So maybe something you want to play around with. Make your columns and beams kind of self-illuminate. Okay? And then in the host file, which in this case was the architectural file, so what I did is I created my 3D views. I set my phasing to the newest phase, which in this case was new construction, and I put my filter again as the transparency. So again, I had to go back through the phase dialog boxes and set all those up for like new and existing. And then this part. You know when you link in Revit models, you just don't want to link them in and just walk away from them. You have a lot of background work to do. Would you agree? Typically, you're not just linking in and saying everything's great. You're going to have to go and edit the settings for the structural link. Would you agree? Or whatever link you're doing. Because again, you know, phasing may come in right, but maybe you don't want to see their columns or mechanical equipment in a certain way. You want to be able to override those settings. This is the part that's very tedious if you've ever had to do this. That's why view templates are really great. So again, over here, under the basics, what I did is I modified their filter to show their filter. Okay, because I wanted to make sure that my filter on my end didn't affect theirs. Does that make sense? So I'm overriding, I'm saying my global filter settings for my phase is not going to affect the structural model. I'm going to use theirs. And that makes managing it, I think, a little bit easier, but a little bit more complicated because you have to go modify their file. Okay, so there's a little bit of a give and take. So basically, I hit the custom button. I changed it over here to structural red. And then under model categories, what I went ahead and did in my case is if I had my own structural elements in there that I didn't want to render, I would turn off my categories and make sure they're turned on theirs. Okay, so again, I'm bringing their stuff. And in addition, on their end, I made sure I turn off the little like rebar and the couplers and all that stuff, right? In case people are modeling that. I don't need to render that. I just want to get a basic model. And again, for my own global settings, I made sure I turned off things like topography and telephone devices or whatever, because I don't care to show that. And then again, you just create a view template and render it out, and it actually looks kind of cool. So it looks like we're pretty much on time here. Any questions? No questions. What do you think? Oh yeah, go ahead. We should chat a little bit afterwards. What version of Revit are you using? 2017. So they changed some of the rendering settings because before I felt like you got better control when you had those daylight portal settings in the earlier version. I think they took that away in 17 because they got rid of one of the rendering engines because I think before they were using like the Autodesk Ray Tracer and like the NVIDIA one. But let's chat afterwards. We could probably figure out a way to make that work. What do you think? I mean, this is just some ideas, but do you think maybe you could take this back and start playing around with some?
Great way to waste an entire afternoon and bill it something.
Absolutely, and that's the goal, right? But there's some good stuff that you could take away from this, I think, and see where you can go develop it even further. So come visit me. I'll be here. Come visit Brian. He'll be here. And find me on LinkedIn if you want to be friends. Thanks, you guys.